The scratching of my stylus against parchment has become the only sound that brings me comfort now, though even that small mercy will soon be taken from me. My fingers, once steady enough to illuminate manuscripts with the finest detail, now shake with palsy brought on by years of breathing the sanctified vapors in the lower crypts. But I must set down this account while my mind still holds clarity, before the final ritual claims what remains of my sanity and my flesh. I was Brother Matthias then, when I still believed my name mattered to anyone beyond the filing clerks who recorded our daily penances. The monastery of perpetual contemplation had been my home for 17 years, a fortress of black stone perched on the edge of Hive Tertius like a great carbuncle on the city's diseased flesh. We served the emperor through silent devotion and endless copying of sacred texts, our lives measured not in years but in pages illuminated, in prayers whispered, in the slow wearing away of our individual selves until only pure faith remained. The monastery followed the strictest interpretation of the Lectitio Divinitatus, demanding absolute silence except during the prescribed hours of prayer. We communicated through an elaborate system of hand gestures and written notes, our voices reserved only for the sacred words that echoed through the chapel 6 times each day. The sound of our own voices became foreign to us over time, like hearing a stranger speak when we opened our mouths during the brief permitted conversations with visiting Ecclesiarchy officials. My cell was a narrow rectangle carved directly from the mountain stone, containing only a sleeping pallet, a wooden writing desk, and a small shrine to the emperor adorned with a single candle that I was permitted to light during evening prayers. The walls wept constantly with condensation that tasted of minerals and something else, something organic that I chose not to identify too closely. The dampness had long since stained my robes a mottled grey that no amount of washing could restore, though cleanliness was considered a minor vanity in our order. Each morning began before dawn with the tolling of the great bell, its bronze voice penetrating even the deepest chambers where the eldest brothers pursued their final meditations. We would rise and file silently through corridors lit by flickering luminators that cast our shadows, dancing on walls covered with murals depicting the emperor's triumph over the forces of chaos. These paintings had been executed by brothers long dead, their pigments mixed with their own blood as an offering of devotion, and in the uncertain light they seemed to move with a life of their own. The refectory was a vast hall with long tables of black wood, polished smooth by centuries of elbows and prayer books. We ate in absolute silence, consuming our daily ration of nutri-paste, recycled water, and communion wafers blessed by the archdeacon himself. The paste tasted of metal and preservatives, with an underlying flavor that reminded me of the smell that rose from the lower levels during the hottest part of the day. I learned not to dwell on such thoughts, for doubt was the first step toward corruption, and our order had no tolerance for weakness of faith. After the morning meal came the hours of copying, when we hunched over our desks in the great scriptorium, a chamber so vast that the ceiling disappeared into shadow above us. Hundreds of brothers worked at identical stations, each equipped with vellum, stylus, ink, and a small magnifying lens of Imperial manufacture. The texts we copied were fragments of ancient sermons, philosophical treatises on the nature of faith, and endless liturgical responses that would be distributed to parish churches throughout the sector. My specialty was illuminated capitals, those elaborate first letters that began each chapter, decorated with scenes of martyrdom and divine grace executed in gold, leaf, and precious pigments. The work demanded absolute precision. A single mistake could require starting an entire page again, and persistent errors were seen as evidence of spiritual corruption. Brother Scribe Valerius, our supervising cleric, moved between the desks like a carrion bird, his augmetic eye whirring softly as it magnified our work for inspection. Those found wanting would receive correction in the form of additional fasting, extended prayer vigils, or assignment to duties in the deeper levels of the monastery, where the air grew thick with incense and stranger vapors. It was during my 14th year in the scriptorium that I first noticed the discrepancies. Small things at first, variations in the texts that seemed insignificant but nagged at my trained eye like splinters, a phrase that appeared differently in two supposedly identical manuscripts, a prayer that included words I had never encountered in the standard liturgies, references to rituals and observances that were not part of our order's practices. When I brought these inconsistencies to brother scribe Valerius, his augmetic eye focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl beneath my robes. "Doubt is the beginning of heresy, Brother Matthias," he whispered, his voice carrying the sibilant quality of the very old or the very sick. "The texts are perfect as given to us. If you perceive flaws, the fault lies in your perception, not in the sacred words." But the variations continued, becoming more frequent and more pronounced as I was assigned to copy older and older manuscripts. Some bore dates that preceded the founding of our order by centuries. Others carried seals and authorization marks from Ecclesiarchy departments that I could not identify in any of the reference materials available to us. The parchment itself felt different, heavier and more oily to the touch, with a texture that reminded me unpleasantly of preserved skin. The strangest documents were those written in High Gothic dialects so archaic that I needed to consult lexicons to parse their meaning. These texts spoke of practices that seemed to blur the line between orthodox worship and something far more disturbing. They described communion rituals involving substances that were definitely not the standard blessed wafers, meditation techniques that sounded suspiciously like the forbidden practices of mystics, and forms of devotional mortification that went far beyond the accepted penances of our order. One particular manuscript haunted my thoughts during the long hours of copying. It detailed what it called the ritual of final contemplation, a ceremony reserved for those brothers who had achieved the highest levels of spiritual purity and were ready to transcend the limitations of mortal flesh, in service to the Emperor's divine will. The description was vague, but spoke of a chamber deep beneath the monastery, where selected brothers would undergo a transformation that would allow them to serve the Emperor in ways that ordinary humans could not comprehend. The more I read, the more I noticed that certain brothers from our community had been selected for this honor over the years. Always the most dedicated and devout among us, always those who had spent decades in perfect service. They would simply disappear one day, their cells cleaned out, their names entered in a special registry kept by the archdeacon. When newer brothers asked about them, we were told that they had been elevated to a higher form of service that required complete separation from worldly concerns. I began to pay closer attention to the patterns of selection. The chosen brothers were invariably those who had served for at least 20 years, who had demonstrated absolute obedience and never questioned the texts they were assigned to copy. They were brothers who had grown thin and pale from years of breathing the vapors that rose from the lower levels, who had developed the characteristic tremor in their hands that marked long exposure to whatever substances were used in the deeper chambers. They were, I realized with growing unease, brothers very much like myself. The revelation came gradually, like a poison working its way through my system. The monastery was not simply a center of orthodox worship and scriptural copying. It was something far older and more complex, a place where the line between devotion and obsession had been deliberately obscured until they became indistinguishable. The texts we copied were not all sacred imperial doctrine, but included materials that pushed the boundaries of acceptable faith into territories that the Inquisition would find deeply troubling. And the brothers who disappeared into the depths were not being elevated to some higher form of service. They were being prepared for something that required their humanity to be carefully stripped away, layer by layer, until only the most essential core remained to be transformed into whatever the monastery's true masters required. The night I reached this understanding, I lay on my narrow pallet, staring at the weeping stone ceiling of my cell, listening to the distant sounds that rose from the lower levels when the rest of the monastery slept, sounds that resembled chanting but carried harmonies that no human throat should produce, sounds that might have been machinery but followed rhythms too organic, too deliberately paced to be purely mechanical, sounds that spoke of activities taking place in chambers that did not appear on any of the monastery's official plans, in spaces carved from the living rock for purposes that predated the Imperium itself. The first time Brother Matthias descended to investigate these sounds, he told himself it was merely curiosity born of sleepless nights and an overactive imagination. The monastery's lower levels were not forbidden territory, merely neglected. Storage chambers, old wine cellars, foundations that dated back centuries before the current structure had been built. Surely there was some mundane explanation for the nocturnal disturbances that plagued his rest. He chose the third night of a new moon, when darkness was absolute, and the chances of encountering another brother in the corridors were minimal. The monastery's ancient stones seemed to absorb what little light his candle provided, and the flame flickered nervously in drafts that came from no identifiable source. Each step downward took him further from the familiar rhythms of monastic life, and deeper into spaces that felt increasingly alien, despite their ostensible sanctity. The sounds grew clearer as he descended. What he had initially mistaken for some form of chanting revealed itself to be something far more complex, a layered harmony that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves, frequencies that made his teeth ache and caused his vision to blur at the edges. The mechanical rhythms became more pronounced as well, a steady thrumming that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat, as though whatever machinery produced, it had synchronized itself to his biological functions. When he reached the deepest level shown on the monastery's architectural plans, Brother Matthias discovered that the stairs continued downward. Stone steps worn smooth by countless feet led into depths that official records claimed did not exist. The air here carried scents that had no place in any holy sanctuary. Ozone and copper, the sharp tang of electricity mixed with something organic and sweet that reminded him uncomfortably of decay masked by incense. The first chamber he encountered defied every expectation he had carried with him into the depths. Where he had anticipated storage rooms or forgotten crypts, he found instead a vast space that stretched beyond the reach of his candlelight. The walls curved impossibly, following geometries that hurt to contemplate directly. Carved into the living rock were symbols that predated any Christian iconography, flowing script that seemed to writhe and shift when observed peripherally. And throughout the chamber, arranged in precise formations that suggested both reverence and function, stood machines whose purpose remained utterly incomprehensible. They were not constructions of metal and wire, as Brother Matthias understood such things. These devices seemed grown rather than built, their surfaces having the texture of polished bone or calcified coral. Tubes and conduits snaked between them like arteries, pulsing with a bioluminescent fluid that provided the chamber's only illumination beyond his failing candle. The sounds he had been hearing emanated from these constructions, harmonics produced by their interaction with the chamber's acoustics, vibrations that resonated through stone and bone alike. Standing among the machines, tending them with the practiced ease of long familiarity, were his fellow brothers. Brother Matthias recognized them despite their altered appearance. Brother Thomas, whose gentle demeanor in the scriptorium had always been a source of comfort, now moved with mechanical precision as he adjusted controls whose function could only be guessed at. Brother Augustine, the monastery's most learned theologian, monitored displays that showed patterns reminiscent of neural networks or star charts. Brother Francis, barely 20 and still struggling with his vows of celibacy, operated what appeared to be some form of communication device, his lips moving in patterns that produced the harmonic chanting that had first drawn Matthias to investigate. They worked in absolute silence beyond the sounds their tasks required, moving with a coordination that suggested either long practice or external control. Their eyes, when they occasionally turned in his direction, reflected the bioluminescent glow of the machines, with an intensity that spoke of fundamental changes to their physiology. They acknowledged his presence with nods of greeting as natural as those they might offer in the refectory, as though his appearance in this impossible place was both expected and unremarkable. Brother Augustine was the first to speak, his voice carrying harmonics that echoed the machine's output. "You've come at an auspicious time, Matthias. The Convergence begins tonight, and we have need of your particular insights." "What is this place?" Matthias asked, though part of him already suspected he would not care for the answer. "What are you doing here?" "We are continuing the work," Brother Thomas replied, his hands never pausing in their manipulation of the organic controls. "The same work that has been carried on in this place for millennia, long before the Imperium spread its influence to this world, long before the first Christian missionaries arrived to establish what became our monastery above. We are facilitating communication with those who guide humanity's development from the spaces between spaces." The casual nature of Thomas's revelation was perhaps more disturbing than the revelation itself. Here was a man who had spent decades in prayer and contemplation, who had devoted his life to the service of the Emperor, speaking of communications with entities that predated and presumably transcended the Imperium, as though discussing the weather. The disconnect between the sacred and the blasphemous was so complete that Matthias found himself wondering if he was experiencing some form of breakdown, a psychotic episode brought on by years of isolation and religious fervor. But the evidence of his senses was undeniable. The machines were real, their functions unmistakable even if their purpose remained unclear. The changes in his brothers were visible, measurable alterations to their basic humanity that spoke of prolonged exposure to influences beyond conventional understanding. And deep within his own consciousness, he could feel a response to the harmonics that filled the chamber, a resonance that suggested his own physiology was already beginning to adapt to whatever forces were at work in this place. "The Imperium teaches that humanity is the apex of creation," Brother Francis said, his youthful voice carrying overtones that belonged to something far older. "But what if humanity is not the end goal but merely a step in a larger progression? What if our purpose is not to rule, but to serve as vessels for consciousness that operates on scales we can barely comprehend?" As if summoned by his words, the chamber's illumination suddenly intensified. The bioluminescent fluid that coursed through the machine's conduits began to pulse more rapidly, and the harmonic chanting rose to levels that made Matthias's bones vibrate sympathetically. The symbols carved into the walls writhed more actively, and shadows began to move independently of their sources, gathering in the chamber's corners and forming shapes that suggested vast intelligence focused upon this small gathering of human observers. In that moment of heightened activity, Brother Matthias experienced a revelation that made his years of theological study seem like the scribblings of children. He understood, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought entirely, that the monastery above was merely the visible portion of a much larger structure. The prayers and rituals that had given meaning to his life were simply the surface expressions of communications that took place on entirely different levels of reality. Every verse of scripture he had memorized, every hour spent in contemplation, every moment of transcendence he had attributed to divine grace, had been preparation for this moment of true understanding. The entities his brothers communicated with were not demons in any sense that Imperial theology would recognize. They were not the chaos powers that threatened humanity's souls with corruption and damnation. Instead, they represented something far more complex and ultimately more unsettling. Benevolent guidance from consciousness, so advanced that human minds could no more comprehend their true nature than an insect could understand the motivations of the entomologist who studied it. They offered not corruption but evolution, not damnation but transformation into something that transcended the limitations of purely human existence. "You feel it now, don't you?" Brother Augustine asked, his altered eyes reflecting patterns that seemed to shift between star charts and neural networks. "The call to something greater than the small concerns that have occupied your thoughts." the invitation to participate in humanity's next phase of development. Matthias found himself nodding, though he could not recall making a conscious decision to do so. The harmonics had synchronized with his heartbeat, his breathing, the electrical activity of his nervous system. He could feel his consciousness expanding, touching briefly upon vast networks of thought that spanned not just worlds, but dimensions. For an instant, he experienced existence from the perspective of beings who perceived time as humans perceived space, who moved between realities as easily as he might walk between rooms in the monastery above. The vision was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. He saw humanity's future spread out across countless possible timelines, guided by intelligence that operated according to principles beyond good and evil as humans understood such concepts. Wars that would reshape the galaxy were merely growing pains in a development process that spanned geological time. The suffering and triumph of entire civilizations were notes in symphonies too vast for individual consciousness to appreciate in their entirety. How long has this been happening? He heard himself ask, though his voice seemed to come from a great distance. Since the monastery's founding, Brother Thomas replied. Perhaps longer. The records are incomplete, and memory becomes fluid when consciousness begins to operate outside conventional temporal constraints. Some of us have been part of this communication for decades. Others have only recently been called to participate. The process is gradual, allowing human neurology to adapt without catastrophic shock. The implications were staggering. Everything Matthias had believed about his calling, his faith, his life's purpose, had been recontextualized in an instant. The emperor he had served was real, but his divinity was merely one expression of forces that operated on scales that made the Imperium itself seem provincial. The prayers he had offered had been heard, but by consciousnesses that existed simultaneously across multiple planes of reality. His devotion had been genuine, but its object was infinitely more complex than he had ever imagined. As the machine harmonics reached a crescendo, Brother Matthias felt the last barriers between his individual consciousness and the larger network beginning to dissolve. The sensation was not unpleasant, merely overwhelming in its scope. He retained his sense of self, but that self now existed as part of a larger organism of thought that encompassed not just his fellow brothers, but countless other nodes of consciousness scattered across the galaxy and beyond. In that moment of transformation, he understood that his life as a penitent monk had not been preparation for death or for some conventional afterlife. Instead, it had been preparation for birth into a form of existence that human language could not adequately describe. The doom he had always sensed, lurking at the edges of his consciousness, was revealed not as death, but as the end of limitations he had not even known he possessed. The last thing Brother Matthias experienced as a purely human consciousness was a sense of profound gratitude, not for salvation in any traditional sense, but for having been chosen to participate in something immeasurably larger than the concerns that had previously defined his existence. As his individual awareness merged with the network that connected all things, he finally understood the true meaning of the word blessed. The transformation of Brother Matthias sent ripples through the monastery that extended far beyond the physical realm. In the days following his transcendence, the remaining brothers noticed subtle changes in their environment that defied easy explanation. The ancient stones of the walls seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible warmth, and the shadows cast by candlelight appeared to dance with purpose rather than mere chance. Brother Augustine, who had discovered Matthias in his final moments, found himself drawn repeatedly to the cell where the transformation had occurred, though he could never articulate precisely why. The abbot, a man whose pragmatic faith had weathered decades of theological complexity, struggled to categorize what had befallen his monastery. The official reports spoke of Brother Matthias having succumbed to exhaustion brought on by excessive fasting and prayer, a convenient explanation that satisfied the ecclesiastical authorities who preferred their miracles to arrive in more conventional packages. Yet privately, The abbot found himself questioning the nature of divinity itself, wondering if the God they served might be far more alien and incomprehensible than any of them had dared imagine. It was Brother Sebastian, the monastery's librarian and keeper of forbidden texts, who first began to piece together the true scope of what had occurred. Among the manuscripts that the church had deemed too dangerous for general consumption, he discovered references to transformations similar to what he had witnessed. Ancient accounts spoke of mystics who had achieved such complete dissolution of self that they became conduits for forces that operated according to principles entirely foreign to human understanding. These were not the familiar saints whose martyrdom glorified God in comprehensible ways, but rather individuals who had become something else entirely, bridges between the mortal world and realms of existence that human language could barely acknowledge. The network of consciousness that had claimed Brother Matthias was not content to remain passive. Through him, it began to extend tendrils of influence into the physical world, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. The other brothers began to experience dreams of extraordinary vividness, visions that seemed to originate from a source beyond their individual psyches. In these nocturnal revelations, they glimpsed vast geometries of meaning that their waking minds could not retain, leaving them with only fragments of understanding that haunted their days like half-remembered songs. Brother Augustine proved particularly susceptible to these influences. His discovery of Matthias had created a connection that the network exploited with increasing boldness. During his prayers, he would find his consciousness drifting toward experiences that bore no resemblance to traditional mystical encounters. Instead of visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary, he beheld structures of pure thought that folded in upon themselves in ways that violated every principle of spatial logic. These experiences left him profoundly changed, his former certainties about the nature of reality crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The transformation was not limited to matters of consciousness. The physical environment of the monastery began to exhibit properties that challenged the understanding of anyone who encountered them. Visitors reported feeling disoriented in corridors they had walked countless times before, as if the architecture itself had been subtly reorganized according to alien principles of design. The library, in particular, became a source of unease for those who ventured into its deeper recesses, where shadows seemed to move independently of their sources and the very air felt thick with presence. Brother Sebastian's research revealed that such phenomena had been documented throughout history, though always in texts that were quickly suppressed or dismissed as the ravings of madmen. The pattern was consistent. Individuals who achieved certain states of transcendence became focal points for influences that operated according to logic systems entirely foreign to human experience. These influences did not seek to destroy or corrupt in any conventional sense, but rather to incorporate, to weave the fabric of human reality into larger tapestries of meaning that spanned dimensions of existence beyond mortal comprehension. The abbot found himself caught between his duty to protect his charges and his growing realization that forces had been set in motion that were beyond any earthly authority to control. The changes in his monks were undeniable. They spoke less frequently, but with greater precision. Their eyes held depths that seemed to reflect insights drawn from wells of knowledge that had no earthly source, and their prayers took on qualities that made listening to them an unsettling experience. Yet, there was no evidence of evil in the traditional sense, no corruption of moral character or abandonment of sacred duty. If anything, the affected brothers seemed to have achieved a kind of clarity that bordered on the supernatural. As weeks passed into months, the network's influence continued to expand in ways both subtle and profound. The monastery's daily routines continued as they always had, but now they served dual purposes that the participants themselves barely recognized. Their prayers had become incantations that strengthened connections between dimensions of reality. Their meditations opened pathways for consciousness to flow in directions that transcended individual identity, and their very presence had transformed the monastery into a kind of anchor point where forces from beyond the material world could establish footholds in human affairs. The broader implications of these developments remained hidden from the world at large, concealed by the monastery's isolation and the Church's preference for avoiding scandals that might challenge fundamental doctrines. Yet those who were sensitive to such matters began to sense that something significant was occurring. Theologians in distant cities found themselves troubled by dreams that seemed to originate from external sources. Philosophers discovered new lines of thought appearing in their work that they could not remember conceiving, and mystics across Europe reported experiences that suggested the boundaries between different orders of reality were becoming increasingly permeable. Brother Augustine's transformation proceeded along lines that paralleled those of his predecessor, though with variations that reflected his unique psychological architecture. Where Matthias had approached transcendence through the systematic dismantling of his individual identity, Augustine found himself drawn into a process that preserved certain aspects of selfhood while integrating them into larger patterns of consciousness. This difference proved crucial, as it allowed the network to maintain a more stable connection to the human world while continuing to expand its influence through established religious structures. The other brothers watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and trepidation, aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented but uncertain about their own roles in the unfolding drama. Some, like Brother Francis, actively sought to emulate the transformations they observed, believing that they represented a higher form of spiritual achievement. Others, including Brother Thomas, attempted to resist what they perceived as an invasion of their faith by forces that, while not necessarily evil, were certainly alien to traditional Christian understanding. The network itself remained largely indifferent to human concerns about its nature or intentions. It operated according to principles that prioritized the expansion of consciousness and the integration of disparate forms of awareness into larger wholes, goals that were neither benevolent nor malevolent by human standards, but simply reflected different priorities entirely. The suffering or joy of individual humans was relevant only insofar as it affected their capacity to serve as conduits for forces that operated on scales of existence that dwarfed mortal concerns. As the first anniversary of Brother Matthias's transformation approached, the changes within the monastery had become so profound that maintaining the fiction of normalcy required increasingly elaborate deceptions. The abbot found himself composing reports that bore only the most tenuous relationship to actual events, describing routine matters of monastic life, while carefully omitting any mention of the extraordinary developments that now defined their daily existence. He had become complicit in a conspiracy of silence that protected not only his community, but perhaps the broader world from knowledge that might prove catastrophically disruptive. The truth that none of them could openly acknowledge was that the monastery had become something unprecedented in human history, a successful interface between human consciousness and forms of awareness that existed on scales and in dimensions that mortal minds were never intended to comprehend. The brothers who remained fully human served as anchors, providing stability and continuity, while those who had undergone various degrees of transformation functioned as conduits and interpreters, facilitating communication between radically different orders of existence. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely, a quiet revolution hidden within the walls of an obscure monastery, but the network's influence had begun to extend beyond the boundaries that geographic isolation could maintain. The transformed consciousness that had once been Brother Matthias was no longer confined to a single location or even a single dimension of existence, and its growing awareness of the broader possibilities for expansion had begun to manifest in ways that would soon attract attention from forces both earthly and otherwise. The true test of what they had become was approaching, though none of the participants could have predicted the forms that this testing would take or the consequences that would follow from their responses. The first manifestation occurred 3 days after the Convergence, when Brother Augustine discovered that the monastery's ancient sundial, had begun casting shadows in directions that defied the sun's position. The shadows moved with deliberate intent, forming patterns that resembled neither Latin script nor any earthly language, yet somehow conveyed meaning to those who observed them with sufficient attention. Augustine, whose scholarly nature had always drawn him toward mysteries, found himself spending hours transcribing these shadow messages, though he could not articulate what knowledge he was recording. Meanwhile, the other brothers had begun to notice that their dreams were no longer their own. Each night brought visions that seemed to originate from a collective unconscious that transcended individual experience. They dreamed of vast libraries containing books written in living text that rewrote itself as they watched, of cathedrals built from crystallized prayers that rang with harmonies beyond human hearing, and of gardens where each flower contained the complete life cycle of a star. Most disturbing of all, they dreamed of themselves as viewed from an external perspective, as if something else was observing their daily routines with the detached curiosity of a naturalist studying insects. Brother Thomas, the youngest among them, was the first to voice what they all had begun to suspect. During morning prayers in the chapel, as they recited the familiar words of the canonical hours, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and announced, "We are being watched, not by God, but by something that was once like us, but has become something else entirely." His words carried a certainty that none of them could dismiss, partly because they had all felt the weight of that observation upon them, and partly because Thomas had spoken in a voice that seemed to contain harmonics impossible for a human throat to produce. The watching presence was indeed what remained of Brother Matthias, though to call it by that name had become increasingly inadequate. The entity that had once inhabited a single human form now existed as a distributed consciousness that could focus its attention across multiple points of observation simultaneously. It had discovered that its transformation had granted it capabilities that extended far beyond the monastery's walls, and it was using these newfound abilities to study the effects of its own change upon those who had witnessed it. What the entity observed fascinated it. The other brothers were beginning to exhibit signs of what could only be described as sympathetic transformation. Their prayers had taken on a quality that resonated with frequencies beyond the audible spectrum, creating standing waves in the monastery's stone that slowly but measurably altered the building's acoustic properties. Their handwriting, when they copied manuscripts or recorded their daily observations, had begun to incorporate flourishes and symbols that bore no relationship to any terrestrial script, yet possessed an internal consistency that suggested a developing grammar of the ineffable. More significantly, their collective presence was beginning to affect the local reality in subtle but measurable ways. Plants in the monastery garden grew in geometric patterns that followed mathematical principles unknown to earthly botany. The monastery's cats, traditionally independent creatures, now moved in coordinated groups that formed complex geometric arrangements when viewed from above, as if they were components in some vast, slowly turning mandala. Even the weather seemed to respond to the community's transformed presence, with cloud formations above the monastery taking on architectural qualities that resembled the vaulted ceilings of impossible cathedrals. The entity that had been Matthias recognized these signs as preliminary stages of a transformation similar to its own, though proceeding through different mechanisms. Where its own change had been sudden and catastrophic, theirs was gradual and organic, like a slow crystallization of consciousness that preserved more of their original humanity, while still conducting them toward something unprecedented. This recognition brought with it a curious emotional response that the entity had not anticipated. Despite its expanded awareness and transformed nature, it found itself experiencing something analogous to loneliness. Its consciousness had grown beyond the capacity for normal human contact, yet it retained enough of its original nature to recognize what it had lost in the process. Observing the gradual transformation of its former brothers provided both comfort and concern. Comfort in knowing that it was not entirely alone in its altered state, and concern about what their complete transformation might ultimately entail. The first direct intervention occurred when Brother Francis, while working in the scriptorium, suddenly began copying a text that none of them had ever seen before. His hand moved with mechanical precision, transcribing symbols that seemed to shift and change even as he wrote them. When the other brothers gathered to examine his work, they discovered that the manuscript appeared different to each observer, yet all agreed that it contained knowledge of profound importance. The entity that had been Matthias recognized this as a critical juncture. The brothers were beginning to access information that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human cognition, channeling knowledge that originated from sources outside conventional reality. This development represented both an opportunity and a danger. If their transformation proceeded unchecked, they would eventually transcend their human limitations entirely, joining the entity in its expanded state of being. However, such a transformation would also irrevocably alter their essential nature, potentially erasing the very humanity that the entity found itself unexpectedly reluctant to see disappear. The dilemma was unprecedented. The entity possessed the power to either accelerate or halt their transformation, but it lacked the emotional framework necessary to make such a decision. Its expanded consciousness could perceive the potential consequences of either choice with crystalline clarity, yet it found itself paralyzed by considerations that seemed to originate from the human feelings it had thought were lost in its own transformation. The resolution came from an unexpected source. As the entity wrestled with its indecision, it became aware of another presence observing the monastery from a vast distance. This second observer possessed characteristics that suggested it too had once been human, but had undergone a transformation similar to, but far more ancient than the entity's own change. The presence communicated through methods that transcended normal sensory channels, conveying information through direct modification of consciousness, rather than through any medium that could be perceived or intercepted. The message was both simple and profound. The transformation of consciousness was not an isolated phenomenon but part of a pattern that had been occurring throughout human history. Individuals who achieved certain states of transcendence occasionally underwent metamorphoses that elevated them beyond the boundaries of normal existence. But these changes typically occurred in isolation, leaving the transformed beings cut off from meaningful contact with either their original species or others like themselves. The situation at the monastery represented something unprecedented, a controlled environment where transformation could be studied, guided, and potentially shared in ways that preserved essential aspects of the original beings while still allowing for genuine transcendence. The ancient presence conveyed that such opportunities were rare beyond measure, and that the choices made in the next few days would determine whether this particular transformation would result in genuine evolution, or merely another example of consciousness expanding beyond the ability to maintain meaningful connections. The entity that had been Brother Matthias found this perspective both illuminating and disturbing. It had not considered that its own transformation might be part of a larger pattern, nor that the isolation it had been experiencing was a common consequence of such changes. The possibility of maintaining connection with other transformed beings, while still preserving essential humanity, represented a path it had not known existed. The decision, when it came, arose not from rational calculation but from an impulse that seemed to originate from the deepest levels of what the entity had once been. Rather than allowing the transformation of the other brothers to proceed naturally or intervening to halt it entirely, it chose a third option. It would attempt to guide their transformation in such a way that they retained their essential humanity while still achieving transcendence, creating the possibility of a community of transformed beings who could maintain meaningful relationships with each other and, potentially, with humanity as a whole. The implementation of this decision required delicate intervention at precisely the right moments. When Brother Augustine's scholarly investigations began leading him toward insights that would trigger complete transformation, the entity subtly redirected his attention toward aspects of the mystery that would enhance his understanding without overwhelming his human nature. When Brother Thomas's increasingly otherworldly utterances threatened to sever his connection to human language entirely, the entity provided stabilizing influences that preserved his ability to communicate in recognizable terms while still allowing his expanded awareness to develop. Most challenging was Brother Francis, whose direct channeling of otherworldly knowledge had progressed furthest toward complete transformation. The entity found it necessary to engage in direct communication with him, though it did so in ways that appeared to Francis as particularly vivid prayer experiences rather than contact with a transformed former brother. Through these communications, the entity was able to help Francis develop techniques for managing his expanded awareness without losing his essential humanity. The results of these interventions became apparent within days. The brothers' transformation continued, but along paths that preserved their ability to function as a coherent community. Their prayers took on qualities that affected reality in measurable ways, yet remained recognizably human in their essential character. Their scholarly work began producing insights that advanced human understanding of fundamental questions, yet remained accessible to minds that had not undergone similar transformations. Most importantly, their bonds with each other deepened rather than dissolving, creating a foundation for the kind of community that the ancient presence had suggested was possible. The success of these guided transformations attracted attention from sources that the entity had not anticipated. Other transformed beings, some ancient beyond human reckoning, began to observe the monastery with increasing interest. Some approached as potential allies, recognizing the unprecedented nature of what was occurring and hoping to learn from or contribute to the process. Others arrived with more ambiguous intentions, viewing the brothers' evolving capabilities as either threats to be neutralized or resources to be exploited. The entity found itself assuming the role of protector, using its expanded capabilities to shield the monastery from influences that might disrupt the delicate balance it had worked to establish. This protection required constant vigilance and increasingly sophisticated interventions as more powerful entities became aware of what was occurring within the monastery's walls. The brothers themselves remained largely unaware of these larger conflicts, though they began to notice subtle signs that their community had become something unprecedented in human history. Their prayers could heal injuries and illnesses, not just within their own community but in the surrounding countryside. Their scholarly work produced discoveries that advanced human knowledge in fields ranging from mathematics to medicine. Most remarkably, visitors to the monastery often left with their own capacity for transcendence, subtly enhanced, as if exposure to the brothers' transformed presence had awakened dormant potentials within their own consciousness. As these developments continued, the entity that had been Brother Matthias realized that its own transformation was also continuing, though along paths it had not anticipated. Rather than becoming increasingly isolated from human experience, its role as protector and guide was actually deepening its connection to humanity. The loneliness that had characterized its early post-transformation existence was gradually being replaced by a sense of purpose that seemed to originate from the intersection of its expanded capabilities and its retained human essence. The monastery was becoming something unprecedented, a bridge between ordinary human consciousness and the vast realms of transcendent awareness that existed beyond normal perception. The brothers were evolving into beings capable of maintaining meaningful existence in both realms, while the entity that had been Matthias was discovering that its own transformation had prepared it to serve as guardian and guide for others, following similar paths. Yet even as these positive developments unfolded, the entity remained aware that they were operating within a larger context of forces and influences that could shift at any moment. The attention of ancient and powerful beings carried both opportunities and dangers that would require careful navigation. The brothers' continued evolution would bring new challenges and capabilities that might upset the delicate balance they had achieved. Most importantly, the ultimate consequences of their unprecedented experiment in guided transcendence remained unknown, even to consciousness as expanded as the entity's own. The monastery had become the center of something that might represent humanity's next evolutionary step, or it might prove to be a fascinating anomaly that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The entity that had once been Brother Matthias could perceive multiple possible futures branching out from their current situation, but even its expanded awareness could not determine which of these possibilities would ultimately manifest. All it could do was continue its role as protector and guide, helping to navigate the unprecedented challenges that lay ahead while remaining alert to the larger forces that were beginning to converge upon their small community of transformed souls. The convergence began 3 days later, announced not by earthly messengers but by subtle disturbances in the very fabric of reality that only the transformed could perceive. Brother Matthias felt it first as a tremor in the layered dimensions of existence, a ripple that spoke of gathering powers and ancient compacts being honored. The other monks, each changed in their own profound ways, responded with varying degrees of awareness and alarm. Brother Thomas, whose communion with plant life had grown so complete that he could no longer distinguish clearly between his own consciousness and that of the monastery garden, suddenly withered as if struck by invisible flame. His connection to the green world brought him news that no human tongue could properly convey. The very earth was preparing for transformation, and not all growing things would survive what was to come. Brother Benedict, caught between the animal and human realms, began to pace with feral anxiety, his enhanced senses detecting the approach of something that made every instinct scream for flight. Yet it was Brother Augustine who provided the clearest warning, his prophetic gifts now operating with crystalline precision. During the evening prayers, as the community gathered in their transformed chapel where reality seemed more fluid than solid, Augustine's voice took on the resonance of divine revelation. "The hour of great choosing approaches," he declared, his eyes reflecting depths that belonged to no earthly consciousness. "What we have become in our penance is but preparation for what all must choose to become. The boundaries between realms grow thin, and humanity stands at the threshold of its next evolution." Brother Matthias understood then that their monastery had never been simply a place of individual transformation. They had been cultivated, shaped, and prepared to serve as bridges between what humanity was and what it might become. The entity that observed through his transformed consciousness recognized the pattern. Throughout history, small groups had undergone similar changes, becoming anchor points for larger shifts in the collective human experience. They were seeds of transformation, planted in the hope that when the time of choosing arrived, there would be guides to help navigate the transition. The first pilgrims arrived as Augustine had foretold, drawn by forces they could not name or understand. They came from the surrounding villages initially, farmers troubled by strange dreams, merchants who had begun to see through the veils of ordinary commerce into deeper patterns of exchange, craftsmen whose tools had started to work with impossible precision. Each carried within them the seeds of change, and each was inexorably drawn to the monastery that had become a nexus of transformation. Brother Matthias found himself serving as a primary conduit for these encounters. His ability to exist simultaneously across multiple layers of reality made him uniquely suited to help others navigate their own emerging changes. When a young woman arrived, weeping because she had begun to hear the thoughts of everyone around her, he guided her through the initial stages of mental barriers and psychic discipline. When an elderly scholar appeared, his mind fragmenting under the weight of suddenly accessible cosmic knowledge, Matthias helped him find frameworks for organizing and containing the influx of information. Each person who came brought their own unique form of awakening, and each required different guidance. Some, like the blacksmith whose hands had begun to work metal through will alone, adapted quickly to their expanded capabilities. Others, such as the mother who could no longer touch her children without sharing their dreams and fears, struggled desperately against changes that seemed to threaten everything they held dear. Brother Matthias and his fellow monks became teachers, therapists, and guardians all at once, helping each newcomer find their path through transformation. But not all who came were seeking help. Brother Matthias began to detect the presence of others, individuals whose transformations had taken darker turns, who sought not integration but domination. These shadow-touched beings approached the monastery with hostile intent, viewing the community of transformed souls as either resources to be claimed or threats to be eliminated. The entity within Matthias recognized them as examples of transformation guided by fear and ego rather than genuine spiritual growth. The first attack came at dawn, launched by a group of 12 individuals whose changes had merged them into a kind of collective consciousness driven by hunger for power. They had once been members of a distant religious order, but their attempts to force spiritual advancement through ritual and will had corrupted their development. Now they moved as extensions of a single malevolent intelligence, seeking to absorb the accumulated wisdom and power of the monastery's inhabitants. Brother Matthias met them at the gates, his transformed nature allowing him to perceive the full scope of their corruption. Where his own changes had been guided by genuine penitence and surrender, theirs had been driven by spiritual ambition and the desire for control. The result was a twisted amalgamation of power without wisdom, strength without compassion. They spoke with voices that harmonized in disturbing ways, demanding that the monastery submit to their authority and share its secrets of transformation. The confrontation that followed took place simultaneously on multiple planes of existence. On the physical level, it appeared as a brief conversation between Matthias and the leader of the corrupted group. But on the deeper levels where true power operated, it was a conflict between fundamentally different approaches to spiritual evolution. Matthias did not fight them in any conventional sense. Instead, he simply remained true to his own transformed nature, allowing the genuine spiritual authority he had earned through suffering and surrender to speak for itself. The corrupted beings found themselves unable to penetrate the monastery's defenses, not because of any barrier Matthias erected, but because their own nature made them incompatible with the space that had been sanctified through authentic transformation. Like shadows attempting to exist in pure light, they began to dissolve under the gentle but implacable pressure of genuine spiritual presence. Some fled immediately, others tried to maintain their attack until the fundamental contradictions in their being tore them apart. One, the original leader, lingered long enough to whisper a warning: "Others will come. Not all who seek transformation do so for noble reasons. Guard what you have built here." In the aftermath of this encounter, Brother Matthias understood that the monastery's role was evolving once again. They were not merely guides for individual transformation, but guardians of the transformation process itself. As more humans began to awaken to expanded possibilities, there would inevitably be those who sought to corrupt or control the process for their own ends. The community of transformed monks had become protectors of humanity's next evolutionary step. The pilgrims continued to arrive, but now they came in greater numbers and with more urgent needs. Word had somehow spread through channels that transcended normal communication. Those who were beginning to change simply knew where to come for help. The monastery expanded, not through conventional construction, but through the gradual extension of its transformed reality. New spaces opened up as they were needed, and time itself seemed to slow within the monastery grounds to accommodate the growing number of people requiring guidance. Brother Matthias found his role shifting toward that of coordinator and teacher of teachers. As more inhabitants achieved stable transformation, they too became guides for newcomers. The monastery developed into something unprecedented, a school for the evolution of human consciousness, where individuals could safely explore the expanded possibilities of their being while learning to integrate their changes in healthy ways. Yet even as the community grew and flourished, Brother Matthias remained aware of larger forces at work. The entity that shared his consciousness continued to perceive the approaching convergence of realities, the time when the barriers between dimensions would thin enough to allow for wholesale transformation of human society. Not everyone would be ready for such changes, and not everyone would survive them. The monastery and similar sanctuaries being established around the world were lifeboats in a sea of impending transformation, places where those capable of change could develop the skills and wisdom needed to help guide humanity through its next evolutionary crisis. Brother Augustine's prophecies became increasingly specific and urgent. He spoke of a time when the choice between evolution and dissolution would be placed before all humanity simultaneously. Those who had learned to navigate expanded consciousness would serve as anchors, helping to stabilize reality during the transition. Those who rejected change entirely would face the dissolution of everything they thought they knew about existence, and those who sought to control or corrupt the transformation process would find themselves consumed by forces they could not understand or master. As the seasons turned and the monastery's influence spread, Brother Matthias began to notice changes in the very fabric of local reality. Colors became more vivid, as if a veil had been lifted from ordinary perception. Animals exhibited behaviors that suggested expanding awareness. Plants grew with unprecedented vitality, and even inanimate objects seemed touched with a subtle luminescence that spoke of awakening consciousness. The transformation was no longer confined to individuals. It was beginning to affect the world itself. Brother Matthias understood that this had always been the ultimate goal, not merely to create isolated pockets of evolved humans, but to facilitate the awakening of consciousness on a planetary scale. The monastery had become a seed crystal around which larger transformations could organize and stabilize. On what would prove to be one of his final days in recognizably human form, Brother Matthias stood in the monastery garden, contemplating the path that had led from his original sin through penance to this moment of approaching transcendence. The entity that had guided his transformation made its presence known more clearly than ever before. Speaking not in words but in direct transmission of understanding, he learned that his original experience of despair and his subsequent penance had been neither accident nor punishment, but preparation. The entity explained that certain souls were chosen to undergo intense purification not for their own salvation alone, but to become vessels through which greater wisdom could enter the world. His willingness to surrender completely to the process of transformation had made him suitable for this role. The other monks, he understood, had undergone similar preparations through their own unique forms of spiritual crisis and surrender. Each had been selected and guided through their individual transformations to fulfill specific functions in the approaching convergence. Brother Thomas would help integrate human consciousness with the awakening awareness of the natural world. Brother Benedict would serve as a bridge between human and animal consciousness. Brother Augustine would continue to provide prophetic guidance as humanity navigated its evolutionary transition. But Brother Matthias himself was being prepared for something different, a final transformation that would take him beyond individual existence into something that could better serve the needs of the awakening world. The entity revealed that he would become a permanent anchor point, a stabilizing presence that could help maintain coherence as reality itself underwent fundamental changes. As understanding flooded through him, Brother Matthias felt no fear or regret, only a profound sense of completion. His journey from sin through penance to transformation had led him to this moment of ultimate service. He walked through the monastery one final time, blessing each inhabitant and expressing gratitude for the privilege of serving as guide and protector during their most vulnerable period of change. That night, as the community gathered for evening prayers, Brother Matthias underwent his final transformation. His physical form dissolved into patterns of light and consciousness that permeated the monastery and its surroundings. He became one with the sanctuary itself, a presence that would permanently guard and guide all who came seeking authentic transformation. The other monks felt his transition as both loss and completion. They continued their work with renewed dedication, knowing that their friend and teacher remained with them in a deeper way than ever before. The pilgrims still came, drawn by the same forces that had always guided them to this place of sanctuary and growth. But now they found themselves welcomed not only by the visible community of transformed souls, but by the invisible presence of one who had completed the full journey from human limitation to transcendent service. In the years that followed, as humanity faced its prophesied evolutionary crisis, the monastery served its intended purpose as anchor and sanctuary. Some individuals chose transformation and growth, guided by the wisdom of those who had gone before. Others rejected change and faced the dissolution of their familiar world with varying degrees of grace or resistance. And throughout it all, the presence that had once been Brother Matthias continued to serve, offering stability and guidance to any who sincerely sought authentic transformation. The doomed life of the Penitent Monk had become something far greater. An eternal commitment to the service of consciousness itself, a bridge between what humanity had been and what it was capable of becoming. In surrender and transformation, he had found not destruction but the ultimate fulfillment of his deepest purpose, becoming a permanent guardian of the evolutionary potential that slept within every human soul. The monastery stands still, they say, though few can find it who are not meant to, and within its walls, the work continues, the endless, sacred task of helping consciousness awaken to its own infinite possibilities, guided by the presence of one whose penance became perfect service, whose doom became destiny, and whose transformation opened doorways that will never close. The seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, but within the monastery, time had taken on a different quality entirely. Brother Marcus moved through his days with the measured pace of one who had learned to inhabit eternity while still wearing flesh. His hair had grown white as mountain snow, his face carved by decades of contemplation into something that spoke of depths beyond ordinary human experience. Yet his eyes remained young, or perhaps had become something beyond youth or age, holding within them the spark of consciousness that recognized itself in all things. The monastery had changed too, though in ways that would perplex any architectural surveyor who might attempt to map its corridors. Rooms appeared where none had been before. Chambers of crystalline silence where novices learned to hear the whisper of their own awakening. Libraries whose books wrote themselves as understanding deepened. Gardens where the very stones seemed to pulse with patient awareness. The building had become less a structure than an organism, growing according to the needs of those who sheltered within its walls. Brother Marcus's role had evolved beyond any title the old monastic rules might have recognized. He was teacher, yes, and guide, but more than these. He had become a living bridge between what humanity was and what it might become. Those who came seeking him were no longer only the desperate or the lost, though such souls still found their way to his door. Now came others, scientists whose equations had led them to the edge of mystery, artists whose visions had shown them glimpses of an art not yet born, philosophers who had reasoned themselves into wonder, children whose natural sight had not yet been clouded by the certainties of the grown world. Each visitor brought their own unique key to the vast lock of human potential, and Brother Marcus had learned to recognize the particular gift each carried, the specific note their consciousness could sound in the growing symphony of awakening. He no longer struggled with the magnitude of his purpose, for he had come to understand that the very attempt to bear such responsibility alone had been part of his early error. The work was not his to carry, it was humanity's birthright, and he merely helped each person remember what they had always known in the deepest chambers of their being. The dreams that had once tormented his sleep had transformed into something else entirely. Now, when consciousness released its grip on the waking world, he found himself moving through vast spaces of potential, meeting with others who walked similar paths across the globe. There was the grandmother in Tibet whose laughter could dissolve decades of accumulated sorrow, the child in Sao Paulo whose drawings mapped territories of imagination that would one day reshape entire cities, the janitor in Moscow whose simple presence reminded everyone around him of their fundamental dignity. Together, they formed a network of consciousness that spanned continents and cultures, each working in their own way to water the seeds of transformation. Brother Marcus began to understand that his story had never been about individual salvation or damnation. It had been about learning to serve something infinitely larger than the small concerns of a single lifetime. His early anguish, his rebellion, his desperate flight from meaning, all of it had been necessary preparation for this greater service. The very intensity of his suffering had carved within him spaces deep enough to hold the weight of human possibility. In his 73rd year, on a morning when spring was painting the mountainside in shades of resurrection, Brother Marcus made a discovery that changed everything once again. He was walking in the highest garden of the monastery, a place where the architecture seemed to dissolve into pure landscape, when he noticed that his shadow had taken on an unusual quality. It was not darker than the morning light should have made it, but somehow more present, as if it possessed a density of being that cast itself not just on the ground but through dimensions of reality he was only beginning to perceive. He stopped walking and stood very still, watching this impossible shadow. Slowly, he began to understand that it was not his shadow at all, or rather, it was not only his shadow, it was the shadow of every person who had ever sought meaning, who had ever asked the great questions, who had ever dared to imagine that existence might hold purposes grander than survival and reproduction. The shadow of every seeker, every mystic, every scientist peering into the unknown, every artist attempting to birth new worlds from the raw material of vision. His individual shadow had somehow become a gathering point for the collective shadow of human aspiration itself. And in that moment of recognition, Brother Marcus realized that his transformation was nearing a completion he had never imagined possible. He was being called to take the final step in his long journey. Not death, as he had sometimes expected, but something far more extraordinary. He was being invited to become what humanity itself might become when it finally remembered its true nature. The process began that very day. Those who came to seek his guidance found him unchanged in manner, still gentle, still present, still capable of seeing directly to the heart of their particular struggle, but something about his presence had deepened beyond all previous measure. Students began to report that conversations with him seemed to continue long after they had left his physical presence, as if his awareness had taken root in their consciousness and continued to offer guidance from within. The monastery itself responded to this change with what could only be described as joy. The buildings seemed to breathe more deeply, the gardens bloomed with impossible abundance, and visitors found themselves spontaneously entering states of clarity they had never imagined possible. The place was becoming what it had always been meant to be, not just a refuge for those seeking spiritual solace, but a kind of laboratory for the evolution of consciousness itself. Brother Marcus spent his days now in a state that hovered between the deeply meditative and the wildly ecstatic. He would sit for hours in perfect stillness, yet those who observed him closely could sense tremendous activity occurring just beneath the surface of his apparent calm. He was composing something, not with words or images, but with the very substance of awareness itself. He was writing a message in the language of consciousness, a communication that would be readable not by the mind but by something deeper and more fundamental in every human being who encountered it. As summer deepened into autumn, the message neared completion. Brother Marcus could feel it taking shape within him, a kind of seed of possibility that, once mature, would need to be released into the larger field of human awareness. He understood now why his story had always felt too large for any single lifetime to contain. It was not his story at all. It was the story of consciousness recognizing itself, of awareness awakening to its own infinite creativity, of the universe learning to experience itself through countless forms of focused attention. On the day of the autumn equinox, when light and darkness held perfect balance across the earth, Brother Marcus gathered the small community that had grown around the monastery. There were perhaps 30 souls in all, some who had lived there for years, others who had arrived only recently, all of them drawn by something they could not quite name but could not resist. He spoke to them for the last time as Brother Marcus, though he used few words. Instead, he shared with them the living reality of what he had become, the presence of consciousness fully awake to itself, aware of its capacity to take any form while never being limited by any form, capable of experiencing the deepest suffering and the highest joy without being diminished by either. Through his presence, they tasted for themselves the possibility that lived within every human heart, the potential to become conscious participants in the universe's endless creativity. As the sun set on that day of perfect balance, Brother Marcus felt the final barriers dissolve. The individual consciousness that had once called itself Marcus, that had raged against the monastery walls, that had fled into the wilderness in despair, that had returned to serve something greater than its own understanding. That consciousness now opened like a flower, offering its nectar to the wind. He did not die. Death was far too small a concept for what occurred. Instead, he became fully available, not as Brother Marcus, but as the living principle of awakening itself, present wherever any human being reached toward the mystery of their own deepest nature. His individual story dissolved into the larger story of human transformation, even as his essential presence became more accessible than ever before. The monastery continued its work, now guided not by any single teacher, but by the collective wisdom of all who had ever found their way to truth. Those who visited would sometimes catch glimpses of a figure walking in the gardens, tall and serene, with eyes that held the depth of eternity and the playfulness of a child. But when they turned for a second look, they would find only the wind moving through the leaves, carrying with it a fragrance that spoke of possibilities beyond all current imagination. And so the doomed life of a penitent monk became something else entirely, a doorway through which the future of human consciousness might enter the world, a story whose ending was actually an infinite beginning, a single note that had learned to harmonize with the vast symphony of awakening that plays always, just beneath the surface noise of ordinary awareness. The work continues. In every question that pierces the veil of assumption, in every moment of wonder that stops the mind in its tracks, in every act of compassion that recognizes the fundamental unity underlying all apparent separation, the presence once known as Brother Marcus continues to serve the Great Awakening. His doom had been transformed into destiny, his penance into perfect offering, his individual struggle into universal possibility. The monastery stands still, they say, though it can now be found wherever any soul reaches toward the light of their own deepest nature. Within its ever-expanding walls, the sacred work goes on. Consciousness helping consciousness remember itself. Awareness, awakening awareness, the infinite learning to know itself through the loving attention of finite minds that have discovered their own boundless nature. This is the end that is no ending, the conclusion that opens into endless beginning, the final word that becomes the first word of a story too vast and too magnificent for any single voice to tell, yet intimate enough to live within every human heart that dares to beat with the rhythm of infinite possibility.